I think part of the reason why teams at the top are so good is because they got good at one point, and then the roster was strong enough that only the best players could make the team. So you have really good players, but they're just playing in a third or fourth line role, getting third, fourth line minutes, and so they get paid a third or fourth line salary. Whereas on a weaker team, like the Oilers, they'd be getting a larger role with more minutes. For example, I would imagine that the fact that Justin Schultz was playing first pairing minutes was at the heart of how he was able to get a $4 million contract for this past season. So, even though someone may not be as good of a player, they tend to get paid according to what the average pay is for that particular job in the NHL. There is some upward or downward pressure based on how they perform compared to other people who are in that role in the NHL, but a lot of contract talks at least start with he plays X minutes per night, Y minutes on the PK, and Z minutes on the power play, and this is what other players around the NHL who are in those roles make. And so you end up having bad players get big contracts. So a player like Schultz, just because he plays for a worse team, ends up getting a larger role and therefore a larger paycheck. You may be wondering why it is that I'm using him as my example since he's been traded to Pittsburgh. I still think he's the most pertinent example, especially because it was well publicized with his struggles versus the amount that he was being paid, to be able to illustrate this, and using the Oilers as the example because, hey, the Oilers are what I follow, so that's what we'll go with. Everyone knew Schultz wouldn't be worth $4 million a season on another team, but with how bad the right-hand side of the Oilers' D-core is, Schultz ended up playing those kind of minutes, and so we had to pay him, and so up until the trade deadline, we were stuck with him. Considering his contract and his play so far in the NHL, most people would consider us lucky to get just a third-rounder for him. A third-round draft pick for a first-pairing defenseman. Chicago wouldn't have any use for a player of his caliber on a $4 million contract. They would pay him maybe $1.5 to $2 million per season if he could even crack their lineup, which is doubtful. This explains how a player like Artemi Panarin, a grown man who has been playing professional hockey since the 08-09 season, can then come to the NHL and still qualify as a rookie. And then people gush about how amazing Chicago's development system is. Nonsense. They simply have so much depth that any draft pick who doesn't pan out for them, they're never forced to allow them into their NHL lineup, so it doesn't hurt them. They can select only the very best. Panarin was tied for 4th in KHL league scoring last year. Not exactly a gamble now, is he? Meanwhile, the Oilers, because they're already bad, have had to constantly gamble on putting draft pick players into their lineup. This also explains how a team like Detroit stays good year after year. All you need is a stable core, and you can afford to only take the best players and put them into your lineup. Dylan Larkin is a huge anomaly for them, and perhaps a sign that they're on their way out finally. Unfortunately, most people think about these things all wrong. I should know, until recently I thought the same way. They think if your team starts lower, you get better draft picks, and so therefore will be better off. The truth is, if you start with a solid roster, you don't have to gamble on young players anymore, and that changes everything. You have the luxury of simply watching them to see how they pan out. Meanwhile, we continue to do things like offer big contracts to bad players and spend even more draft picks on players like Griffin Reinhart who've never done anything to earn an NHL spot because we're desperate. Stronger teams are in a much better position and trade roster players to weaker teams for those bad teams' high draft picks all the time. Every season, pretty much. That completely negates the draft disadvantage of finishing higher. For us, it's even worse. We didn't even trade our picks for a roster player. We traded them for a prospect. The Islanders have lots of defensive depth, and they knew that Griffin hadn't done enough to be able to crack their roster. And so they used him essentially as free currency in order to be able to trade him away to make their team better. To pile on to that, as you may know, Griffin Reinhart was selected by the Islanders 4th overall in the 2012 draft. However, his actual scouting ranking going into the draft was much lower. He was ranked 10th out of North American skaters going into that draft. Combined rankings had him as more like 16th overall, which was the exact value of the first rounder that the Oilers traded away in order to acquire Griffin this past summer. The Oilers, of course, felt that that wasn't a high enough price, and the Islanders were going to take anything that they could get, so the Oilers also added on the number 33 overall pick in last year's draft as part of the price for Reinhart as well. And this is for a guy who they'd had enough years to observe that they knew wasn't panning out in the Islanders organization. But hey, what is it? One man's trash is another man's treasure. So, we'll pick him up and we'll use him. It just goes to show that the Oilers essentially have made themselves a second-tier team. We're using other teams' cast-offs as our starting players. I'm sick of seeing us get taken advantage of, and that's never going to change until some people take this franchise on their back and make our roster harder to crack. Management also needs to stop going the Tambellini route and stop trading away our future for subpar players. It always comes back to haunt the team. If we'd kept our draft picks during this rebuild phase, our system would have been flooded with so much talent by now that likely, despite other attempts to sabotage what has been going on with big contracts for bad players, we still would have had so much depth that the team should have been fixed by now. Alternately, they could go all in, trade away a ton of draft picks in order to fill up all of our roster weaknesses all at once, make the roster harder to crack and solve the problem that way. The way it's been done, though, I know is wrong. Where each year we trade away several future prospects in order to get a couple of roster players, and then we do that again the next year, and again the next year, and we never acquire enough good players to be able to fill all of our roster spots all at once, and therefore fix the team. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Of course, keep in mind that a team having a solid roster is no guarantee that they're going to continue to have a solid roster in future. I mean, there are things about the salary cap and specifically the collective bargaining agreement that ends up making this situation worse, as in the players end up needing to be paid a certain amount because they've played a certain amount of minutes. I believe that there's certain minimums of salary that people need to be paid, which certainly doesn't help the Oilers. But even if you have a good roster, like Vancouver had for several years, it's easy to make a roster bad just by making several bad trades. I would argue that Tambellini did that with the Oilers, and obviously Jim Benning or the Aquilinis, who knows how much of it's management, how much of it's ownership in cases such as that. But to contrast that, you have Chicago is good season after season, San Jose, you have obviously Detroit, who made the playoffs each year for a quarter century, who may finally be on their way out, but yeah, just let me know what you think. As I've said with the other couple of videos I've done, I'm more of a podcast guy. I have lots of episodes of the Oilers Fan Podcast. The link to that is down below. However, I do the occasional video, so if you want to be able to see it, by all means subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed it.